disability, the issues in life, the struggles of life, whether it's a disability, whether it's some other suffering related, that it falls within the sovereignty of God, that you're not somehow outside of the sovereignty of God because of something in your life, that God is sovereign and that he is in control.
Welcome to the Modern Ministry Podcast, where we discuss issues facing ministry leaders today with pastors, theologians, biblical scholars, and some Liberty alumni in hopes of offering encouragement and insight towards more faithful and fruitful ministry efforts. I'm Dr. Troy W. Temple, Dean of the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity and the Liberty Theological Seminary, and we are so glad you've joined us today on this episode. On this episode, we are blessed to hear from one of our very own faculty members in the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity. Dr. Hulshof is Associate Professor of Religion with expertise in Old Testament, inductive Bible study, and the theology of suffering and disability. And that last area is why he is joining us today on the podcast. Dr. Hulshof, thank you for being here with us today on this episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a treat to be here with y'all.
I appreciate that. You know, you've done a lot of research, some significant research on suffering and disability, even publishing a recent book, Jesus and Disability, which is a guide to creating an inclusive church. Before we dig into that, could you share your story or your journey that brought you to this point with this topic?
Yeah, for us, at least for myself and for my wife and I, this is a topic that is something we're interested in as from a family. My wife and I have one son. He was born with infantile epilepsy. And so when we spent the first 2 years of his life kind of tracking, trying to control the seizures, trying to mitigate them. And so we tried everything for 2 years to try and get a hold of them. Nothing, whether it was medicine or diet, all the things you could use to control seizures, none of them actually worked. And so one of the things we were told early on is that because of the location of the bad brain tissue in my son's brain, that brain surgery was always a possibility. So when he was 2, we elected to have the one half of his brain removed. And what that did was allow us to be able to control, or as best we can, to mitigate his seizures, so that generally speaking, he's seizure free. But that has led to basically a life that has been impacted by disability. And so my son's life is impacted by disability. My wife and myself, our lives are affected by disability because of the impact it has on his life. And so that was one of the things then for us, now navigating the things that we would normally do in life. What does it look like when disability is involved? And so one of those things is obviously church. What does it look like to go to a church, to participate, to attend, to be members in a church that is a disability inclusive environment? And so that's really kind of what started it. It's something that's personal for me. It's something that's professional. I teach in this area. It's also something that's academic. As you mentioned, I've studied in this area. And so I really I'm interested in this space for those 3 reasons. It's personal, it's professional, it's academic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's great to hear that story and to just get a peek in on your journey. And no doubt, we in talking with you today, you're part of a community of people all around the world, really, but especially here in the United States in the local church, who are in the local church. And there are families who have experiences that relate in certain ways to your lived experience. But then there's also another population who they're not connected to the local church. And so they have unique, probably, experiences and whether they be failures or successes that probably look a little bit different. As we think about some of the core underpinnings of theology of anything, we want to find out what are those core doctrinal truths that shape how we approach, how we discuss, and then how we respond. And so, like you said, you teach a course in theology, in the theology of suffering and disability. That sounds like it relates, though, to many more people than just those that we probably visually can identify that would be included. as you include suffering and disability. What are the core doctrinal truths that frame our understanding of suffering and disability?
Yeah, and what I would say is you're right. The not all suffering is disability, and not all disability is suffering. And so that's that. When you're in a space like suffering and disability, it's more. It's not a singular concept kind of thing. And so when I talk about theology in the space, there are kind of three things that I always like to draw attention to because I think they serve as foundation for not only questions related to suffering, but questions that relate to disability. First is the sovereignty of
Yeah.
God. That disability, that issues in life, the struggles of life, whether it's a disability, whether it's some other suffering related, that it falls within the sovereignty of God, that you're not somehow outside of the sovereignty of God because of something in your life, that God is sovereign and that he is in control. And I think that that's the first one. There's a good comfort in knowing and believing and trusting in a God who is sovereign. So that's the first one. I think the second one is the reality of life in a fallen world. We live in a fallen world. This world that we live in is not how it was created to be. And so things like death and disease and disability, these are things that are in our life because of sin and because of the fall and because of the brokenness in the world. Oftentimes, I like to talk about sort of life between two trees, right? In Genesis, in the opening chapters in Genesis, you've got the tree that's in the garden of the tree of life that's in the Garden of Eden. Fast forward to the end of the book, you've got the tree of life again, but it's now not in a garden, but in the eternal city. And
Right.
our address, and it would make a terrible address to put on a return envelope or something, but our address is between the trees. We live between those two trees, and
Mm.
because that's the reality of our address, we live a life that will know sin and will know suffering and will know disability. That there's no way to escape that because of the world we live in. And then the third thing I'd
Right.
say is the image of God. That every individual, regardless of ability or disability, is an imager of God. Now, when you put those three things together, especially the last two, what you have is a good platform or framework for ministry. Why? Because what we share is brokenness. You may not have a disability like my son. I may not have a disability like others, but we share brokenness. We all share
Mm.
brokenness, but we also share the fact that we image God. And so it's the shared brokenness and the shared imaging that allow us to minister alongside of each other.
Right.
If we only have one or two of, if we only talk about one of those things, so let's say, for example, we're talking about image of God, then what happens is my ministry will almost always be sort of a downward direction. Why? Because, well, you're the least of these, and I, because of I because I'm not disabled, I'm not broken, and well, you have a disability and you are, and so that ministry will almost always be down. And
Right.
so when we talk about disability and we talk about suffering and we focus in on the sovereignty of God and then specifically the brokenness of the world and the fact that we're imagers of God, that allows for ministry to happen, a ministry with or a ministry alongside. When you alter any of that, you don't end up with ministry, you end up with sympathy.
Mhm.
You end up with something that isn't ministry simply because, well, I have something that you don't, and I'm supposed to do this for you, and so here I am. And so
Right.
when we talk about a theology of suffering and disability, those are really three of the core principles, core theological points that I always like to highlight with our students or with anybody that we're talking about. It's the sovereignty of God, it's the image of God, and it's the shared brokenness that we all have.
I really appreciate that. The accentuation on the shared brokenness that we all have, as well as the Imago Dei, both of those I would say are open doors to pursuing the Great Commission and ultimately the good news of the gospel. And so when those opportunities come together like that, honestly, a ministry to those who are experiencing, severe suffering as well as physical, some type of disability, it becomes a stewardship and a calling for the church to come alongside, to care for, to reach out to disciple in more pronounced and intentional ways. Is that how that connects?
Yeah, and I think one of the things with that shared brokenness is that it's counter to our culture, right? We live in
Right.
a culture where nobody wants to admit they're broken. Nobody wants to admit that it's what you show on social media, right? Nobody wants to look. I want you to see this image, not that one, and so we don't
Right.
show brokenness. The one of the if you I don't know, Biddy and Bo's coffee shop is a coffee shop that's kind of going up the East Coast now, and it's a coffee
Okay.
shop that's primarily has individuals with a disability, typically Down syndrome, that are working there. And one of the
Right.
shirts that they wear is a shirt that says, "I'm not broken." And the reason they have to wear that shirt is because our culture looks at individuals with disability and say, "Hey, you're broken. I don't have a
Oh, okay.
disability, so I'm not." But the reality is every single one of us has a t-shirt on that says "I am broken" on it, and there's nothing that you and I this side of heaven can do to change that. And so
Mhm.
it's that part that becomes not only something that we can talk about with the culture. Look, the
Right.
reality is that we are all broken, but it's also something that, from a church perspective, that leads to good theological conversations of what does it mean to be an image bearer, what does it mean to image God, and how does
Right.
that relate to the fact that we live in a fallen and broken world, and that
That's good.
brokenness means you and I are broken as well.
That's right. That's right. You mentioned how the culture speaks and how we can learn a lot from what we see in culture, even though they're not necessarily part of a local church or even believers. As church, have you seen, are churches doing better in this area, or is there still a significant need for growth? And it maybe even the question is, how big is the need for in our culture?
Yeah, so it's kind of both and. Even, if my son is 21, and so over the 21 years that been involved with churches in this space, has there been improvement and growth? Absolutely. Is there still room for improvement and growth? Absolutely.
Right.
I think one of the things when I talk with pastors about this, and I say, look, what you need to realize is that families with individuals who have disabilities, now, we are low hanging fruit. If you show me that you love my son and that you care for my son and
Yeah.
that you are interested in coming along my son and man and being a part of his life, we will be there every time the door is open. And I
Yeah.
think oftentimes that just gets missed alongside of everything that goes on in ministry. I think part of the issue is, and this is, it kind of speaks to ministry and it speaks to disability ministry. I think in churches, we do ministry at like 1,000 miles an hour, right?
Right.
It's very programmatic. It's fast moving and it's fast paced. And you can't do disability ministry that way. The speed of
Right.
disability ministry is like 3 miles an hour.
Right. It's a whole
And
different
so
pace.
there's something about disability ministry that calls the church to slow down and invest in individuals, get to know individuals, work with individuals, love individuals. And there's something about that creates a different kind of ministry in the church, because you can't do ministry at 1,000 miles an hour. You can't do disability ministry at 1,000 miles an hour.
Wow. So thinking about that and understanding the cultural need, the world around us, the perspectives. If I'm a pastor and there's a pastor maybe listening to this podcast, what are the most pertinent issues for ministry leaders today who earnestly desire to, well, do better in coming alongside families in the disability community?
You said it right there. The word is families. I think what often happens is when we think about disability ministry, we think of ministry to an individual, right? But disability has affected, has impacted Connor. It's affected my whole family, my wife and myself. It has affected our lives, and so disability ministry is family ministry. Unlike unlike other ministries, like, it's family ministry. And
Right.
so if you think about, well, it's this family and they've got this child who has Down syndrome, or they've got this child who has autism, or they've got this child who has epilepsy. So how do we support that child? How do we support that student? No, you're thinking too small. How do you support that family?
Right.
Disability ministry is family ministry, and one of the first things that must happen is thinking through, what does it look like to come alongside and minister to this family. If you're
Yeah.
ministering just to the individual, you've missed it, because it is
Right.
more than just that individual. Every member of that family has been affected, has been impacted by that disability.
That's good. That's good. Well, I would kind of wrap up with this question for pastors and leaders who are seeking to minister more intently and intentionally to the disability community and those families. Are there some practical things they can do to get started?
Yeah, and I think probably the big one, the first one, is just awareness. I think a lot of times, yeah, I think this is a need, but I don't really know what that looks like in my church, and so one of the things that I usually suggest as I talk through this with pastors who are asking that kind of question is, do you know what it's like to come to your building on a
Right.
Sunday morning with a disability? I said, so for example, picture someone who shows up in a wheelchair, someone who, so now they're in the parking lot and they're going to go from the parking lot to the sanctuary, and they're in a wheelchair. Do you know what that experience is like? And most of the time, the response I get back from pastors is, no, I have no idea what that's like. And I said, so do this. Monday, if there's nobody in the church Monday, or whatever day you kind of feel like there isn't anybody around the building, find yourself a wheelchair and then
Yeah.
start in the parking lot, and then go, okay, now I'm coming into the church and I'm getting out of my car in the parking lot. First of all, I need some help with the wheelchair in the car. Do I have that here or not? Whoa, wait, no, we don't. Well, maybe we do need somebody out here more than just what we, okay, so now there, okay, so where is the ramp to get to the sidewalk to get into the building? Oh, it's
Right.
way over there, but the handicap parking, the handicapped accessible parking is, well, wow, they're not even close. Okay, so now I get to the building. Do we have greeters or not? Okay, we have greeters. So hopefully the door big enough for a wheelchair to get
Hmm.
through? Hopefully it is.
Right.
So now that I'm in, I need to use the restroom. What is that? There's so many things. All of a sudden, what happens is when you put yourself in that position, you
Right.
become aware of how actually disability friendly your church could be. Now,
You
that's
do a
just
personal
physically.
walkthrough. I mean
Yeah,
that,
it's
and
it, it's a
yeah.
walkthrough, and it's
Hmm.
something we would do this with Connor all the time because of Connor's visual impairment. One of the things we do, especially if we had a new teacher, is we had a mask, one of those cheap 99 cent Party City masks, and we had it kind of blocked off so that if they were to put it on, they would see the classroom as Connor sees the classroom,
Okay.
and it helped
Yeah.
them get a picture of, look, if you wonder what Connor sees, what he's going to struggle with, what he's going to miss, put this on. That'll help you with the shape of the classroom. And so that's that same kind of experience. You are pulling into your church going, okay, what does this look like now? Is this now? That's the physical part of this, but there's a bigger aspect of this, because you can have that blue handicapped accessible sticker on your window in front of your church to mark
Right.
your church off as accessible, but the people may not be acceptable. And so there is both physical and theological work that has to be done. Your church needs to be prepared theologically for what it means, and just basically starting with, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? So
Right.
that you have a building that's accessible and people that are acceptable. Those are the two things that, when combined with family ministry, make for a very strong ministry to families with disability. You've got a church that is accessible, you've got people that are acceptable, and a ministry that says it's not just about the individual, but it's about the family. We want to minister to that family.
That's very good. I love those handles that you give there, and acceptable and accessible. Those are really two good handles, I think, to think through this. Well, I just want to say thank you for spending time with us on the Modern Ministry Podcast. This has been really insightful and hopefully very encouraging to those who are listening. And hopefully, we'll be able to see a greater number of families from the disability community who are impacted both as a part of the community and accepted, as well as being thought about when they're coming to that church, and ultimately that they get to know what it means to be loved by the body of Christ.
Amen.
I appreciate that. Well, for our listeners, if you want to learn more about the theology of suffering and disability, I encourage you to get Dr. Hulshof's book, Jesus and Disability, a guide to creating an inclusive church. Some of the things we talked about here on this episode are covered in that text, and I am 100% confident that it will help encourage you to be more faithful in serving your community. Well, for our listeners, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast. For information on Liberty University, you can go to liberty.edu. For information on the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity, you can go to liberty.edu/divinity. And if you want more information on the Liberty Theological Seminary, go to liberty.edu/seminary. We look forward to gathering with you on the next episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast, where we're encouraging leaders with biblical truth, cultural insight, and leadership application.